My guest this week on the Europe Conversation is Russian political activist Vladimir Kara-Murza. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison in Siberia for criticising Putin's war in Ukraine. He was released in 2024 as part of a prisoner swap. But he tells me that despite everything, he's still optimistic about the future for Russia and Ukraine. Vladimir Kara-Murza, Russian opposition politician, former political prisoner. Thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I'm sure so many people have said this to you, but obviously you should not be here. You were poisoned in 2015 and 2017. You had a 5% chance of living. You were told you were in a coma for a month. And then just a couple of years ago, you were sentenced to 25 years in prison in Siberia. And you managed to be released as part of a deal with the former US President Joe Biden. Tell us first of all about that. The first time you got poisoned, what exactly happened? How did they do it? How did you realise what was happening?
Well, I'd been involved in Russian opposition politics for many years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov, who was the most prominent leader of the Russian democratic opposition, former deputy prime minister, who was assassinated in front of the Kremlin literally 10 years ago in 2015. I came to work with him back in 1999, and I was myself a candidate for the Russian parliament back in 2003 when it was still possible for opposition candidates to be on the ballot. Today it's unimaginable. And for many years, Boris Nemtsov and I were involved in the international advocacy campaign for the passage of Magnitsky Act, so the laws that would introduce targeted personal sanctions in the form of visa bans and asset freezes against officials of the Putin regime and of any other dictatorial regime around the world who are personally complicit in human rights abuses and corruption. And as you can imagine, that's not a very popular thing in the Kremlin because these people, the people around Putin, have long been used to the idea of stealing in Russia. And I was first poisoned in May of 2015. I had no doubt from the beginning that it was the Russian security service, but now we know, thanks to an international media investigation led by Bellingcat, that have identified actually the people, not just the unit, but the specific people, officers in the Russian FSB, whose task it is to physically liquidate political opponents of Vladimir Putin. This was May 2015. I was at a meeting with my colleagues in Moscow, and suddenly I felt that I had difficulty breathing. And then I felt like I couldn't breathe at all, and I started to sweat. My heart began to beat really, really fast, and before I knew it, I was unconscious. It's a very scary feeling to feel that you're dying. This is what I felt like. I felt that this is the end. And then I was brought to a hospital, and doctors told my wife that I had about a 5% chance to live. I was on on artificial life support with a multiple organ failure, in a coma, and the official diagnosis that was given to me at my Moscow hospital was toxic action by an unidentified substance, which, translated from medical speak to normal human language means poisoning. I did survive. The doctors saved my life, and then I had to basically spend a year to learn to walk again, to learn to use a spoon again. I mean, everything was just gone. And then as soon as I was able to, I went back to Russia and resumed my work, but then it happened again in February 2017, the exact same thing, same diagnosis, same conditions. And now, thanks to that amazing Bellingcat investigation, we know of the existence of this special unit within the Russian FSB, the Russian Federal Security Service. And so this is the reality of today's Russia, that there is a special government unit whose job it is to physically eliminate, to murder political opponents of Vladimir Putin.
You're outspoken against the corruption and the sort of sanctimony and so on within Russia. And that trajectory has left us to a place where it's impossible to have an opposition politician. People are being poisoned, falling out, being thrown out of windows, assassinated on foreign soil and so on. I mean, how did it get to that point? Was it that the international community ignored Putin?
Well, it was shocking and shameful, frankly, the way many Western leaders behaved when Putin came to power. There's this myth that is often propagated nowadays by people both inside but also outside of Russia, very often for reasons of self-justification. And the myth is that there was some kind of an early Putin who was supposedly okay, who believed in reform and modernization and cooperation with the West. And then something went horribly wrong along the way, and now it's this Putin who's doing all these things. Nothing could be further from the truth. Putin was Putin from the very beginning. In fact, I remember very well the day I understood exactly who that man was and what direction he would take our country. On the 20th of December, 1999, this was before he became president, he was still prime minister, he came to Lubyanka Square in Moscow at the former KGB, now FSB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov, a long-time former Soviet KGB chief, who was one of the people instrumental in the 1956 invasion of Hungary, who was somebody who prioritized the suppression of domestic dissent when he was chairman of the KGB, somebody who embodied everything that was wrong with the communist system. And it is to this man that Vladimir Putin chose to unveil a memorial plaque. In Russia, symbols are important. In Russia, symbols matter. And I had no more questions. He could not have chosen a more potent symbol to signal the direction of his future rule. And just in case anybody had still had questions, in the first year of his presidency, Mr. Putin reinstated the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation.
What do you think when you hear the likes of US envoy Steve Witkoff praise Vladimir Putin and say, oh, he prayed for Donald Trump when he got shot at during one of his rallies, and that he's actually a good guy?
Look, Vladimir Putin, of course, is a former KGB officer, and as he once himself publicly admitted, the favorite part of his job was recruiting people. And to be a successful recruiter, you need to know what your interlocutor, sort of what kind of person he or she is, and you need to sort of get in their trust. And that's exactly what he used when he came to power. George W. Bush was a devout Christian, is a devout Christian, and so when Putin met with him, he told him the story about a cross that his mother had given him that, you know, survived in this massive fire at his dacha and whatever else. And that's when President Bush came out and said he looked into his eyes and saw his soul. And, you know, I think he rightly calculated, Putin did, that the best way to do this with Donald Trump is through personal flattery. And that's exactly what he did with that conversation about praying for him and also, of course, giving him a painting that Mr. Witkoff brought to Washington. I mean, look, these are tricks that have been used by Soviet, and not just Soviet security services, for decades. It's incomprehensible to me how serious people can fall for this kind of stuff in the 21st century.
So let's look at the opposition, because I know for a long time you are very optimistic about the future of Russia. I mean,
I still am.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it doesn't look like there's any hope for optimism. Putin is alive and well, because I remember for a long time people kind of thought that he might have cancer and so on. Doesn't look like there's any chance of him being overthrown. Prigozhin sort of tried that and failed.
I'm not just a politician, I'm also a historian by my education. And one thing we know very clearly from the history of Russia is that all major political change in our country happens like this.
Right.
Swiftly, suddenly, and completely unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days. Literally, not a metaphor. This is how things happen in Russia. None of us knows when or how change will come. What we do know is that nothing is forever. And everything that had a beginning will have an end. And every dictatorship in the history of the world has fallen.
Do you have any ideas that there may be anyone within the regime that would be willing to overthrow Putin?
What I do know for sure is that there are many people in Russia, inside Russia today, who completely disagree with this regime, who categorically oppose this war of aggression. And, you know, when I was in prison, I would receive thousands of letters from all over the country, every month, from people I'd never met, from towns and cities I've never been to, some of them I hadn't even heard of. And these were the people who took the time and the risk, by the way, to write to somebody like me, you know, an enemy of the people, using the official prison's correspondence
system. Those letters
system.
get through to you?
Some did, some didn't, but many did, because they have to go through prison censorship. And, of course, you need to leave all your contact details and so on. And people wrote to say that they think like I do. They think the same of this war as I do. And you will remember last year in 2024, we had a so-called presidential election in Russia with, you know, a circus with Putin and a couple of pre-approved clowns running alongside him on the ballot. And then suddenly there was this guy, this candidate, a former member of parliament and a lawyer by the name of Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he would run as the anti-war presidential candidate, saying he's against the war in Ukraine and he would end it on day one. And the public response was just unimaginable. Suddenly, all over Russia, in large cities and small towns, you would see hours-long queues of people standing at his campaign offices to sign the ballot nominating petitions, because you need to get a certain number of signatures to be registered as a candidate. And this was happening all over the country. And, you know, I would see in the letters, people would send me the photographs from those long lines, and people were saying how important it was for them. Absolutely, because, you know, the Putin propaganda tries to convince everybody, both in Russia and in the West, that, you know, the Russian society is this monolith, that everybody supports Putin, everybody backs the war. And of course, he was not allowed on the ballot, as usually happens in Russia. But that was besides the point, because suddenly people saw that there were people like me, that they were not alone.
Just final question, because, you know, you're obviously a historian as well. What was it like to hear you were being sent to prison in Siberia? Because we hear of Siberia from the Cold War, from the Soviet Union, and even the image of it straight away, it's just cruelty, inhumanity, death. What was it like when you heard that? And what was it like being a prisoner in Siberia? I mean, obviously, you thought you were never coming out. You were given 25 years.
Yes, I was certain I was going to die there, and that exchange that took place last year was a miracle. This is the only way I can describe it. But as a historian, of course, I've read and reread in prison many memoirs by Soviet dissidents, literature on the Stalin period, of course, Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, and of course, books going even further back in the 19th century. The city where I was in prison, for example, Omsk, is a large city in western Siberia. This is where some of the Decembrists were imprisoned back in the early 19th century. This was where Dostoevsky was in prison, so his letters from the House of the Dead was written on his experience in prison in Omsk. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Solzhenitsyn was in that transit prison in Omsk and so on. What was really astonishing to me is that how everything down to the last details is still exactly the same as it was in communist times. For example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in The First Circle, he describes at the very end the route that the prisoners were taken from Moscow to Siberia by, and they went through the Kuibyshev transit prison. Now, Kuibyshev today is called Samara, back to its original name. That was exactly the route I was taken by the Stolypin carriages, which is the Russian prisoner train transports, which again haven't changed in a century. And so, you know, there's this saying that every historian subconsciously wishes to personally experience the subject of his study. I guess be careful what you wish for if that is true.
That's what was going through your head as well, I'm sure, at the same time. As well as that you're doomed, but also, oh, this is how I imagined it.
But also, we know how it ends. We know that none of these regimes continued. We know that all of these regimes fell. The Tsarist regime fell, the communist regime fell, and this one, the Putin regime, will fall absolutely any time. This is the point about Russia. We don't know. It might be in 5 years, it might be in 3 months. Lenin, in his famous speech in Zurich in January 1917, said that we old folks will not live to see this coming revolution. Revolution happened in 6 weeks.
Brilliant. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.